The wind rolled through the dry streets of the frontier town, carrying dust and the faint rattle of a loose shutter somewhere down the road. The old American village lay under the pale morning sun, quiet except for the creaking sign that read, Sheriff's Office. A horse neighed near the hitching post, stamping its hoof impatiently, steam rising from its nostrils in the cold dawn air. Beyond the wooden fences, the hills stretched out bare and brown, the kind of land that didn't forgive mistakes and didn't care who lived or died upon it. It was here, in the heart of that unforgiving wilderness, that a desperate woman made a choice she knew could cost her life. She was an Apache widow, her face marked by hardship and hunger, her hands rough and trembling as she crept through the shadows of the stable. The horse she sought wasn't just any horse, it was the sheriff's own stallion, a tall chestnut with a white blaze and a temper to match his strength. The townsfolk called him Devil's Flame for the way his mane flickered in the sun when he ran across the plains. To steal him was madness, but hunger drives people to do what pride never could. Her moccasins made no sound on the packed earth as she moved closer, eyes darting toward the window of the small office where the sheriff was said to sleep. The year was somewhere near the end of the 1800s, though out here time didn't matter much. The railroad hadn't come this far yet, and the little town of Dry Creek still lived by the sound of boots on boards and the clink of whiskey bottles at dusk. Cowboys passed through with herds, prospectors came and went chasing gold that was mostly gone, and soldiers rode the edge of the desert keeping uneasy peace with the tribes. The Apache had lost much, land, family, dignity, and the woman knew that what she was about to do might only deepen her loss. But her child was sick, and there was no food left in the clay pot by their small fire pit. All she had left was the will to keep going. The sheriff was not a man many dared to cross. Tall, steady-eyed, and known for his silence more than his smile, he had kept order in Dry Creek since before most of the newcomers could remember. Folks said he had once been a soldier, that he'd seen more blood than he cared to talk about. But there was something in him, a weariness that softened his edge. He carried his revolver not as a threat, but as a duty, and though his badge shone bright, his soul was dimmed by things he'd seen on the frontier. Still, no one stole from him, not and lived to tell it. The horse shifted, snorting as she reached for the reins. Her heart pounded hard enough that she feared it might give her away. She whispered soft words in Apache, old words of peace meant to calm animals, but the stallion's ears twitched and his tail flicked restlessly. She froze, listening. The silence of the stable pressed around her until she could hear nothing but her breath. Then came a sound, a door opening slow, the creak of an old hinge, and the unmistakable shuffle of boot heels across wooden boards. She turned her head sharply, eyes catching the faint orange glow of a lantern swinging from the sheriff's hand. He had heard her. His voice came low, not angry, but certain. "That horse'll throw you before you make it past the fence." She didn't answer. Her hands tightened on the reins. For a moment, she thought of running, of mounting and taking her chances across the open land. But she knew she couldn't outpace a bullet. The sheriff stood still, the lantern light showing the tired lines on his face. He saw her clearly now, the tattered blanket around her shoulders, the bruises on her wrists, the fear in her eyes. She wasn't a thief by nature. She was someone life had cornered. "Why?" he asked, his tone more curious than cold. Her throat tightened, and for a long while, she said nothing. Then, barely above a whisper, she spoke in broken English, her voice shaking. "My boy. Hungry." The words came out like stones falling. The sheriff let out a breath and set the lantern on a post. He didn't move closer, didn't reach for his gun. The woman's shoulders trembled as though she expected him to strike her or call for the deputy. Instead, he said softly, "You could have asked." Her eyes flashed with something between shame and anger. "No one gives to Apache," she said, the bitterness raw in her voice, and she wasn't wrong. The townsfolk still looked at her kind with suspicion, still blamed the tribes for raids and burned homes long past. In their eyes, an Apache widow was barely human, something to pity or despise, but never to help. Outside, the wind picked up, whistling through the cracks in the stable walls. The sheriff stood there, watching her with that quiet strength that made most men uneasy. He saw the hunger in her face, the hopelessness that had driven her here. He'd seen that same look before, in soldiers on dying fields, in mothers who buried children beside dry riverbeds. Finally, he spoke again. "Put the reins down," he said quietly. "Ain't no shame in being hungry, but stealing'll get you killed in this town." She hesitated, tears stinging her eyes, her body tense like a trapped animal. When she didn't move, he stepped forward, slow enough not to startle her. His boots scuffed the dirt softly. "I ain't gonna hurt you," he said, his voice low and steady. "I just want you to tell me what you need." The words sounded too kind, too unreal. No one had spoken to her like that since her husband died. He had been shot 2 winters back defending what little corn they had from bandits. Since then, she'd lived off scraps and prayer, carrying her boy across miles of dry land until she found this settlement by the edge of the desert. Her lips trembled. "Food," she said, her voice barely audible. "Medicine." The sheriff nodded slowly. "All right." She blinked, not understanding. He took another step closer, then carefully took the reins from her hands and tied them back to the post. "You stay here," he said. "Don't move. I'll be back." And with that, he turned and disappeared into the cold morning light. For a long time she stood frozen, unable to believe she was still alive. The world outside was waking now. The first wagons rattling down Main Street, smoke rising from chimneys, the faint hum of life beginning again. She thought of running. The open desert was right there, only a few paces away. But her legs wouldn't move. Something in the sheriff's tone, calm, almost gentle, had stripped the fear out of her. Minutes later, he returned carrying a small sack. He set it down near her feet. Inside, she could see dried meat, bread, and a tin of salve for wounds. He didn't say much, just looked at her and said, "For your boy." Her lips parted, but no sound came out. She wanted to thank him, but the words felt too small. Instead, she just lowered her head, tears falling silently on the dirt. The sheriff adjusted his hat, gave her a look she couldn't quite read, and said, "You take him and get out past the ridge by sundown. Folks here don't take kindly to what they don't understand. You stay tonight and they'll make sure you regret it." The warning hit her harder than kindness ever could. She nodded slowly, clutching the bag to her chest. As the sheriff turned to walk away, she looked up and asked softly, Why help me?" He paused, his back to her, the wind tugging at his coat. "Because once," he said, "someone helped me when they shouldn't have." Then he walked off toward the rising sun. The Apache widow watched him disappear into the glare of morning. She knew she couldn't stay. Yet something in her heart shifted, a quiet stirring of trust she thought she'd lost forever. But as she turned to leave, a distant shout broke the fragile calm. From across the street, a man's voice rang out, sharp and furious. "Sheriff! That Apache woman, she's back. She tried to steal again." Her eyes widened, clutching the food tighter. The sheriff stopped mid-step, his hand hovering near his holster, his jaw tightening as townsfolk began to gather. The air grew still, the dust swirled, and in that single breath before anyone moved, both knew what came next could change everything. The crowd outside the stable grew thicker by the minute, boots crunching over the frosty dirt, voices rising in a storm of suspicion. The Apache widow stood trembling beside the post, clutching the small sack to her chest like a shield. She could feel every eye on her, hard, judging eyes that saw not a mother or a widow, but a thief and an enemy. The sheriff stepped forward slowly, his hand still resting near his holster, though his face showed no rage. The townsfolk's shouts were loud now, full of fear disguised as anger. "She's an Apache. You gonna let her walk after what her kind done?" someone yelled. "Hang her!" another cried from the back. The sheriff raised one hand and the noise fell to a low growl. His gaze swept across the men and women before him, farmers, ranch hands, wives clutching shawls against the morning cold. They all waited for his judgment. His voice came calm and steady, carrying the weight of authority. "Nobody's hanging anyone," he said. "She ain't done nothing worth killing over." Murmurs rippled through the crowd. The blacksmith spat in the dirt, glaring. "You call stealing a horse nothing? She's lucky she's breathing." The sheriff looked at him hard. "You ever seen someone steal a horse and not ride off with it?" he asked. The man blinked, thrown by the question. She didn't run, the sheriff continued. She was still right here when I came out. That tells me something. For a moment, silence hung heavy over the street. The people shifted uncomfortably, realizing he was right. Yet suspicion stayed. In this small frontier town, fear was quick to breed hatred, and hatred didn't die easy. The sheriff turned back toward the woman. She stood motionless, her eyes downcast, the morning sun painting her shadow long across the stable wall. Go on, he said to the crowd finally. Ain't nothing more to see. Reluctantly, they began to drift away, muttering as they went. But the blacksmith lingered a moment longer. You keep protecting her, Sheriff, he said darkly, and one day she'll cut your throat for that kindness. Then he turned and stomped off toward his forge, leaving only the echo of his hammering anger in the air. The sheriff waited until the last man had gone before turning to her again. You all right? He asked quietly. She nodded once but didn't meet his eyes. Her hands were shaking as she clutched the food tighter. He sighed. Come on, he said, motioning toward the office, before someone else decides to start trouble. She followed him inside, her bare feet barely making a sound on the wooden floor. The small office smelled of coffee and gun oil. A single map of the Arizona Territory hung on the wall behind the desk, and beside it a framed newspaper clipping yellowed by time. The sheriff poured a cup of water from a tin jug and handed it to her. She hesitated before taking it, her fingers brushing his for a brief instant. He sat down across from her, the floor creaking under his weight. You said your boy's sick, he said. Where is he? She swallowed hard before answering. In the hills, she whispered. Near the creek. I left him in the old miner's hut. Too weak to walk far. How long he been sick? 3 days, she said. Fever, no medicine. The sheriff nodded slowly, jaw tight. You got a name? She hesitated again, unsure whether to trust him. They call me Atsa's woman, she said at last, her tone distant. He was my husband. He died when soldiers came to our camp. The sheriff looked down at the desk, the memory of too many raids flashing in his mind. He'd been part of them once, back when the army called it duty. He had seen villages burn, children cry, and mothers fall silent in the dust. His throat tightened, but he kept his voice steady. I'm sorry, he said. She said nothing, but the tremble in her lip told him she'd heard the weight behind his words. Outside, the noon sun rose higher, spreading gold across the roofs. The town carried on, pretending nothing had happened, but word traveled fast in a place like Dry Creek, and by the time the sun began to sink, the saloon was already buzzing with talk of the Apache widow and the sheriff's mercy. Inside his office, he sat by the window, watching dust drift in the evening light. He thought about what she'd said, about the boy alone in the hills. It wasn't safe for her to stay, but he also couldn't send her out alone after dark. The desert was cruel at night. Wolves and men both prowled without mercy. He leaned back, rubbing his temple. He'd made peace with his past years ago, or so he thought. But now, looking at her quiet silhouette near the fire, he felt that old ache again, the one that whispered of things undone, debts unpaid. She spoke after a long silence. Why you help me? He looked at her, the lines on his face deepened by the flicker of the lantern. Because I ain't forgotten what it's like to lose everything, he said simply. Her eyes softened, though her voice stayed cautious. White men don't help Apache, he gave a tired smile. Guess I ain't like most white men. The door creaked suddenly and a shadow fell across the room. Deputy Cole stepped in, his hat low, his young face full of worry. Sheriff, he said quietly, glancing toward the woman. You sure about this? Folks ain't happy you let her go. Some are talking about taking matters into their own hands. The sheriff's expression hardened. Tell them anyone tries, they'll answer to me. Cole nodded but didn't look convinced. She's Apache, sir. They won't listen to reason. I don't care, the sheriff said. Not tonight. When Cole left, the woman turned toward him, fear flickering in her eyes. They will come, she said softly. They always come. He stood, walked to the window and peered into the darkening street. Not while I'm here. That night, the wind carried the scent of rain and something else. Trouble. The sound of horses echoed faintly from the far ridge. The sheriff sat by the door with his rifle across his knees, his eyes heavy but alert. Inside, the woman fed the small fire with scraps of wood, her thoughts drifting to her boy hidden miles away. She prayed silently that he was still breathing under that old miner's roof. By midnight, the town was quiet, but the stillness felt wrong, too deep. The sheriff heard it too, the kind of quiet that comes before danger. Then came the faint crunch of footsteps outside. He reached for his revolver, gesturing for her to stay back. The door rattled, then swung open as a gust of cold air swept in. 3 men stood there, faces hard, eyes glinting under the lamplight. The blacksmith was among them, a rifle slung over his shoulder. "Evening, Sheriff," he said coolly. "We came to handle what you wouldn't." The sheriff rose to his full height, his voice calm but iron-edged. "You'll handle nothing while I wear this badge." The men stepped closer, boots thudding on the floor. "That woman don't belong here," one spat. "She's poison." "You think folks'll trust you after this?" "You protecting her means you're standing with them." The sheriff's jaw clenched. "I'm standing for what's right." The blacksmith sneered. "Right don't feed us when her kind steals our cattle. Right don't bring back the folks they killed." Before the sheriff could answer, the woman spoke. Her voice trembled but carried strength. "My husband killed no one. He was killed." The room went silent. Even the fire seemed to pause its crackle. Her words hung there, breaking through years of hate and misunderstanding. The blacksmith's face twitched, caught between guilt and anger. "That's what they all say," he muttered. The sheriff took 1 step forward, his revolver still lowered. "You men go home. If you cross this line tonight, there's no going back." The standoff stretched in the heavy air. Then, slowly, the men backed away, muttering curses under their breath as they disappeared into the dark. When the door closed, the sheriff exhaled, his shoulders dropping. The woman looked at him with disbelief. "Why risk your life for me?" He sat again, eyes distant. "Maybe I'm tired of burying people who don't deserve it." The fire burned low, and the clock on the wall ticked softly. She watched him in silence, sensing there was more behind his words than he'd ever say. Outside, thunder rolled across the horizon and rain began to fall, soft at first, then harder, washing the dust from the streets. The sound filled the small room like a hymn. The woman pulled the blanket tighter around her and whispered something in Apache, a prayer for her child and for the strange man who had spared her life. The sheriff sat awake until dawn, staring into the flames, knowing that come morning, the trouble wasn't over. The town would not forget what had happened. Neither would he. And somewhere out in the hills, a sick boy waited for his mother, unaware that her fate and his now rested in the hands of the only lawman in Dry Creek willing to stand against his own people. When the first light broke through the clouds, the sheriff stood, checked his rifle, and said quietly, "We're going to find your boy." But as he stepped outside, boot meeting the wet ground, he didn't notice the figures watching from the ridge, the same men who'd walked away hours ago, now waiting in the rain with their rifles ready. The storm had only begun. The sun crept slow over the horizon, lighting the drenched rooftops of Dry Creek with a pale orange glow. Mud and rainwater glistened in the wagon ruts, and smoke from chimneys drifted weakly against the cold morning air. The sheriff stood beside his horse, tightening the saddle strap with careful hands. His eyes were shadowed from a night without sleep. The Apache widow stood a few paces away, her blanket soaked at the edges, her face pale from exhaustion. She clutched the food sack close to her chest, as if it were the last piece of mercy left in the world. Neither of them spoke much. The silence between them was heavy, filled with all the unspoken things, fear, guilt, and a strange sense of trust neither could explain. When he finally mounted up, he looked down at her and said, "You can ride with me part way. After that, we'll go on foot. The trail's narrow." She hesitated before stepping closer, her small hands gripping the back of the saddle as he pulled her up behind him. The horse shifted under their weight, snorting clouds of white breath into the morning air. With one soft command, the sheriff urged the animal forward, and they rode out past the last houses of the town toward the wide, open land beyond. The trail cut through dry brush and mesquite, winding toward the low hills. The land stretched quiet and endless, the kind that made a person feel small and alone. Somewhere beyond those ridges her boy waited if he was still alive. She closed her eyes, whispering a prayer in Apache, words older than any town or flag that claimed this land. The sheriff listened without understanding, but he could feel the weight behind her voice. It stirred something deep in him, a memory of his own mother's voice long ago, whispering prayers when the world seemed too cruel. He'd buried his faith with the war, but hearing her now made him wonder if there were still things worth believing in. By noon, they reached the edge of the canyon where the land dropped into a tangle of boulders and dry stream beds. The sheriff dismounted, scanning the ground. Tracks, he said quietly. Fresh ones. He knelt, brushing mud from the prints. 3 horses. Maybe 4. They came through last night. Her heart quickened. Men from town? She asked. He nodded grimly. Likely. They're headed the same direction as us. Fear flickered in her dark eyes. They will hurt him if they find him. He stood slowly, tightening his jaw. Not if we get there first. They left the horse behind and climbed on foot through the rocks, moving quickly but quietly. The sheriff knew the country well. He'd hunted outlaws and rustlers through these canyons before, but this time it felt different, like the law itself didn't mean much out here. This wasn't about justice, it was about redemption. The path grew steeper, the wind sharper. She stumbled once, her foot slipping on loose stone, and he caught her by the arm. Their eyes met briefly, his steady and hers uncertain. Careful, he said, his tone softer now. You can't help him if you break your leg. They pressed on, and as the sun sank lower, the rocks turned red with the dying light. At last they reached a narrow ridge overlooking the small valley where the old miner's hut stood. Smoke rose from the chimney, a thin, wavering line that meant someone was there. But it wasn't the kind of smoke that came from a sick child's fire. It was heavier, darker, carrying the smell of tobacco and grease. The sheriff motioned for her to stay low. Crawling to the edge of a rock, he peered down. 3 horses were tied outside the hut. He recognized one of them immediately, the blacksmith's gray mare. He muttered under his breath, "Damn fools." "What do we do?" she whispered, voice tight with panic. "Wait," he said. "They don't know we're here." Inside the hut, voices drifted faintly on the wind, rough, angry tones. The woman's heart pounded as she strained to listen. Then, through the open door, she caught sight of something small lying near the corner, a shape barely moving. Her boy. She gasped softly, her body tensing, but the sheriff grabbed her wrist before she could move. "Not yet," he warned. "You run down there, they'll shoot before they ask questions." Tears welled in her eyes. "He's my son. I know," he said quietly. "We'll get him. Just trust me." They waited until dusk began to settle, shadows stretching long across the valley. The men below drank from a flask, laughing loud and careless. Their rifles leaned against the wall beside them. When one wandered off toward the horses, the sheriff saw his chance. "Stay here," he said, crawling back and loading his revolver with practiced silence. "If anything happens, don't move till I call you." She caught his sleeve before he went. "If you die," she whispered, "they will kill him." He looked at her, the lines of his face hard but steady. "Then I better not die." He slipped down the slope, every step measured, boots barely touching stone. The rain had left the earth soft, masking his approach. Near the hut, one of the men still sat by the fire, half drunk, staring into the flames. The sheriff crept closer, his revolver drawn. He could hear the blacksmith inside shouting at someone, the boy. "What you hiding here for, huh?" the man's voice barked. "You think the sheriff will save you like your ma?" The sheriff moved faster now, stepping through the door without a sound. The blacksmith spun around, startled, his hand going for his rifle, but the sheriff's voice cut through the air, cold and sharp. "Don't!" The blacksmith froze, eyes wide. "Sheriff." "We was just drunk and stupid," the sheriff said. "Step away from the boy." The man hesitated, anger flashing in his eyes. "You're choosing them over us now? After all they done?" The sheriff didn't blink. "I'm choosing what's right." The silence stretched, heavy as lead. Then the blacksmith's hand twitched toward his rifle, and the sheriff fired first. A clean shot that hit the wall beside him, close enough to make him drop it. The echo rang through the valley like thunder. The other men outside shouted in alarm. "Get down!" The sheriff ordered the boy, then turned as one of the others burst through the door. They collided hard, the gun going off wild, smoke filling the small room. The fight was close and brutal, fists, elbows, the smell of gunpowder thick in the air. The sheriff took a blow to the ribs, grunted, and slammed the man against the doorframe until he crumpled. Outside, the horses screamed and bolted as the Apache widow came running down the slope, drawn by the sound of gunfire. She rushed to the hut, calling her son's name. He stirred weakly on the floor, eyes half open. "Mama." She knelt beside him, tears spilling freely now. "I'm here," she whispered, pulling him into her arms. The sheriff stood in the doorway, breathing hard, his revolver still smoking. He looked out into the dusk. The last of the riders had fled into the hills, their shapes fading with the darkness. But he knew it wasn't over. Not by far. When the boy woke fully, he was feverish, his skin hot to the touch. The sheriff found a half-empty jug of water near the fire and poured some into a tin cup. "Drink slow," he said, kneeling beside them. The boy obeyed weakly. The woman looked up at him, voice trembling. "Why do they hate us so much?" He didn't answer right away. The question wasn't one a lawman could answer, not honestly. Finally, he said, "Fear makes folks cruel, and once they start, they forget how to stop." She nodded faintly, brushing hair from her son's face. "We can't stay here." He glanced toward the door. "No," he agreed. "But the storm's coming again. You won't get far tonight." Outside, the wind began to howl through the canyon, carrying the smell of rain and smoke. He barred the door and stoked the fire higher. For a moment, it almost felt safe, but deep down, they both knew the town wouldn't let this go. The sheriff had crossed a line that no man in his position was supposed to cross, and once crossed, there was no way back. He sat by the window, watching the rain streak down the glass. The boy slept in his mother's lap, his breathing shallow but steady. She looked across the room at the sheriff, her voice quiet but firm. "They will come for you too," he gave a slow nod. "I reckon they will." She lowered her gaze, fingers tracing the edge of her blanket. "Then why stay?" He thought about that a long time. The fire cracked softly, filling the silence. At last he said, "Because someone's got to show them what mercy looks like." Outside, thunder rolled again, louder this time. In the distance, through the sheets of rain, faint lights flickered on the ridge, lanterns moving slow, steady, and sure. Men on horseback. The sheriff rose and checked his rifle. "Get some rest," he told her. "You'll need it come morning." But she didn't sleep. She sat awake, holding her child close, listening to the rain and the far-off sound of hooves drawing nearer. The wind pressed against the walls, whispering through the cracks, as if the land itself was warning them. And by the time the first streak of lightning lit the canyon, both knew the storm that had started between the sheriff and his town was only just beginning, and it would decide more than one life before it passed. The storm hit the canyon before dawn, hammering the old miner's hut with sheets of rain that sounded like gunfire on the roof. The sheriff stood near the doorway, rifle in hand, listening through the wind for something more dangerous than thunder. Each gust carried a new sound, branches snapping, rocks tumbling. But beneath it all, he caught the faint rhythm of horses in the distance. He turned toward the Apache widow sitting by the fire with her boy wrapped in a blanket. Her eyes were wide, reflecting the firelight, her face pale with worry. She didn't need to ask what he'd heard. She already knew. The boy's breathing was shallow and his forehead burned hot. She dipped a rag into the water jug and pressed it to his face. "He needs a doctor," she whispered. "He will not last another night." The sheriff's gaze flicked toward her, then back to the dark beyond the door. "You'll have to get him to one," he said quietly. "But not now. Not till it's safe." Thunder cracked overhead, shaking the walls. The fire flickered, throwing wild shadows across the wooden boards. The smell of wet earth and gunpowder filled the room, and the air was heavy with a tension that made even breathing feel loud. Through the downpour, the faint glow of lanterns appeared again along the ridge. There were more now, 5, maybe 6 of them, moving slow but steady, circling like wolves that had caught a scent. The sheriff's jaw tightened. "They didn't quit," he muttered. "Not after last night." The woman stood, pulling her shawl tighter around her shoulders. "They come for you?" she asked. He gave a short, grim nod. "And you." Her hands trembled slightly, but her eyes held firm. "Then we fight." He looked at her, this woman who'd come into his life like a storm of her own, and for a moment, he almost smiled. "You ever used a gun before?" She shook her head. "But I've used a knife." He opened a drawer and pulled out an old revolver, the metal dull and cold. "Let's hope it don't come to that." Outside, lightning flashed, and in that brief white glare, he saw them clearly. Riders spread across the ridge, rifles glinting under the rain. The men from Dry Creek had come to finish what they started. The sheriff knew most of them by name. They weren't outlaws. They were neighbors, men who'd shared his campfire, men who'd once called him friend. But now, they were driven by fear and pride, 2 things deadlier than bullets. Inside the hut, the woman whispered soft words in Apache over her boy's head. The sheriff didn't understand them, but the sound was steady and strong like a heartbeat. It steadied him too. He took one last look at the boy, then at her. "If they get past me," he said, "you take him and run south through the wash. It'll lead you to the old trading post. There's a family there, Carter's folks. Tell them I sent you." She shook her head fiercely. "I will not leave you." He didn't argue. There was no time. The horses were closer now. He could hear the jingle of spurs and the crunch of hooves on wet stone. He stepped out into the rain, his coat whipping in the wind, the brim of his hat dripping water down his collar. The world outside was a blur of gray and lightning. He could barely make out the figures moving in the storm, men shouting to each other over the thunder. "Sheriff," a voice called out from the ridge. It was the blacksmith, his tone sharp as broken glass. "We ain't riding back this time. You got one chance. Hand over that woman and maybe we'll forget the rest." The sheriff stood still, the rain washing the dust and blood from his coat. His voice came calm but strong, carrying through the storm. "You want her, you'll have to come take her. But you won't walk away after." The answer was a gunshot. The bullet struck the post beside him, splintering wood. He ducked behind the doorway, chambering around with steady hands. The sound of hooves broke through the storm as two riders charged down the slope, their lanterns swinging wild in the wind. He waited until they were close, then fired once, the flash lighting the night for an instant. One rider fell, his lantern bursting on the rocks. The other wheeled his horse sharply, shouting for the others. The thunder of hooves echoed as more men rode forward. Inside, the woman flinched at each shot, clutching her boy tighter. She looked toward the door where rain blew in through the cracks. She could hear the sheriff's boots pounding across the porch, hear the shouted curses of men outside. Every instinct told her to hide, but her son's ragged breathing reminded her she had nothing left to lose. Grabbing the revolver he'd left by the table, she knelt near the window and watched the fight unfold. The sheriff was firing from behind a pile of barrels, moving between cover as bullets tore through the rain. He was outnumbered, but he fought with the calm precision of a man who'd seen worse. Each shot he took found its mark, but there were too many of them. Then, through the chaos, she saw the blacksmith creeping down from the ridge, moving wide around the fight. His rifle raised, not at the sheriff, but at the hut. Her heart stopped. He was aiming for her, she didn't think. She fired through the window. The gun kicked hard, the sound deafening in the small room. The blacksmith stumbled, his shot going wide, and disappeared into the mud. Smoke filled her lungs, her ears ringing. She'd never fired a gun before, but she knew she'd bought them a little time. Outside, the sheriff turned at the sound and saw her through the rain, the revolver still trembling in her hands. For a split second, their eyes met, and something passed between them. A wordless understanding that they were no longer strangers bound by circumstance, but allies bound by survival. Then another shot came, grazing his shoulder and spinning him back against the doorframe. He grunted in pain, clutching the wound as blood mixed with rainwater and ran down his sleeve. The world tilted for a moment, but he pushed himself upright, firing again into the storm. The rain turned to hail, pelting the ground in a roar that drowned out everything else. Lightning struck a nearby tree, splitting it in half, the crack echoing like cannon fire. The men on the ridge hesitated, their courage faltering under the storm's fury. The sheriff used the pause to his advantage, limping toward the horses tied behind the hut. He slashed the reins free, hoping to scatter them and create confusion. One of the frightened animals kicked and bolted straight into the ridge, sending two riders tumbling into the mud. Inside, the boy stirred weakly, his small voice barely audible. "Mama." She knelt beside him again, tears streaming down her cheeks. "Hush, my son," she whispered. "We'll be free soon." But even as she said it, she wasn't sure she believed it. The sheriff stumbled back inside, bleeding and soaked, his hat gone, his breath coming in ragged bursts. He slammed the door shut and dropped the bar across it. "They're pulling back for now," he said, "but they'll come again when the storm clears." She tore a strip from her blanket and pressed it against his shoulder. "You bleed too much," she said softly. He gave a weak grin. "I've bled worse." Outside, the wind began to die, leaving only the soft patter of rain. The silence was almost worse than the noise. It meant the men were regrouping. He could feel it in his bones, the calm before another storm. As he sat there catching his breath, his eyes fell on the boy. The fever had worsened, and his skin was ghostly pale. The sheriff's expression hardened. "If we stay, he won't make it," he said. "We move when the rain stops. They'll be watching the trail, but there's another way, through the gulch." She shook her head. "You can't. You are hurt." "I've been hurt before." She looked at him for a long moment, then said quietly, "You do this for people who would kill you?" He met her gaze, his voice low but steady. "I do this because no one else will." The fire burned low, the last of the wood hissing in the damp air. He leaned back against the wall, revolver still in his hand. eyes never leaving the window. Outside, the clouds began to thin, and faint moonlight touched the canyon floor. Then a single gunshot shattered the stillness. The sound echoed through the canyon, rolling like thunder. Both of them froze. The sheriff stood slowly, moving to the window. Far off on the ridge, a lantern flickered once, then went dark. "They're signaling," he murmured. "They know we're trapped." The woman clutched her boy close, her eyes wide with dread. "What do we do now?" He turned toward her, his face calm but grim. "We run!" And as he checked his rifle one last time, the wind carried faint voices through the night. Men shouting orders, horses snorting, boots splashing in the mud. The sheriff knew they had only minutes before the final confrontation began. He looked at her one last time. "Stay close," he said. "Don't stop for anything." She nodded, her trembling hand slipping into his for a heartbeat, a small act of trust in a world that had shown her none. Then, the night exploded again with thunder and the sound of hooves racing through the dark. The sheriff kicked the door open, rifle raised, as they stepped out into the storm-swept world. The rain had stopped, but the danger hadn't, and as they disappeared into the black gulch below, lightning flashed behind them, revealing the silhouettes of riders cresting the ridge. Guns drawn, hearts set on vengeance. The chase had begun, and the final reckoning waited just beyond the next bend in the canyon. The night was dark and cold, the kind that silences even the crickets. The canyon stretched ahead like a wound through the desert, its edges sharp and unforgiving. The sheriff led the way, his steps heavy but steady, the rifle tight in his hands. Behind him, the Apache widow held her son close against her chest, whispering to keep him awake, though her own strength was fading fast. The boy's fever burned like fire, his breath shallow, but his small fingers still clung to her shawl. Every sound, the echo of their steps, the distant rumble of thunder, the restless call of coyotes, felt like it carried the weight of their fate. The sheriff could hear the men following. The faint jingle of bridles, the murmur of curses carried by the wind. They weren't far. The canyon narrowed ahead, the trail twisting along the side of a cliff. One wrong step and they'd fall into the black depths below. The sheriff slowed, scanning the rocks for a way out. A flash of lightning revealed a narrow opening in the cliffside, a small passage that looked barely wide enough for a person to slip through. "This way," he said quietly. She hesitated, clutching her son tighter. "Where does it lead?" "Don't know," he answered. "But it's better than where we came from." They squeezed through the gap, the wet stone cold against their skin. The path opened into a small hollow sheltered from the rain, with an old fire pit and broken stones scattered around. The sheriff recognized it, a forgotten hunting camp from years ago. "We'll rest here," he said. The woman sank to her knees, laying her boy down gently on the driest patch of ground she could find. The sheriff knelt beside her, tearing a piece of his sleeve to wipe the sweat from the boy's brow. "He's still burning up," he said softly. She nodded, her voice breaking. "He's been sick since the river dried. I prayed for rain, but the sky stayed silent. Only when I stole the horse did it come." Her eyes filled with tears. "Maybe God waited until I sinned." The sheriff looked at her for a long moment. "I don't think that's how it works," he said. "Sometimes the good come last in line for mercy, but it comes all the same." He sat back, the exhaustion finally settling in. His shoulder throbbed, the wound reopened by the climb. He tried to ignore it, keeping his focus on the narrow path below where lanterns still glimmered in the dark. The men were spreading out, searching. He knew they'd find the tracks soon enough. He also knew he couldn't run much longer. When dawn broke, it came slow and pale. The rain had stopped, and a thin mist drifted through the canyon. The sheriff woke to the sound of soft sobbing. The woman was holding her boy's hand, whispering prayers in Apache, her voice shaking. He was still breathing, but barely. The sheriff knelt beside them and opened his saddlebag. He pulled out the small tin of salve he'd taken from the town doctor long ago, back when medicine was scarce, and men had to make do. He rubbed it over the boy's chest and whispered, "It's all I got, but it might help." She looked up at him, tears streaking her dirt-stained cheeks. "You've done enough," he shook his head. "Not yet." As the morning warmed, the boy stirred faintly, his breathing easing a little. Hope flickered in her eyes for the first time. She touched his face and smiled weakly. "He lives," the sheriff nodded but didn't smile. He knew what came next. The sound of horses was growing louder again. They were close, too close to outrun this time. He stood slowly, loading his rifle with the last of his bullets. "You take him and go through that wash," he said, pointing toward a narrow trail that led toward the open plains. "It'll take you south. Keep going till you reach the Carter farm. Tell them who you are. They'll help." Her eyes widened. "And you?" He looked toward the ridge, where the first riders were appearing through the mist. "I'll keep them busy." She shook her head fiercely. "No, you come with us." "I can't," he said quietly. "If I do, they'll find you before you get a mile." Her hands trembled as she reached out, gripping his arm. "You saved us. Let me save you." He pulled his arm free gently, meeting her gaze with tired eyes. "Ain't no saving me. Not anymore. But I can make sure he gets a chance." The boy stirred again, whispering weakly, "Mama." She looked down at him, torn in two. She wanted to argue, to make him come, but she saw the truth written in the sheriff's face. He had already chosen. She leaned forward and pressed her forehead to his arm. "May the spirits guide you," she whispered. He gave a small nod, his voice rough. "Maybe they already have." When she vanished down the trail with her boy in her arms, he turned toward the ridge, the rifle steady in his hands. The riders came fast now, shouting his name, demanding he give up. He stepped into the open, his coat flapping in the wind, his badge glinting faintly in the weak sun. "Morning, boys," he called, voice calm as if he were greeting old friends. "You sure you want to die over a woman and a child?" The blacksmith spat in the dirt. "She ain't worth your blood, Sheriff." "Step aside," the sheriff smiled faintly. "Then you come take her." The first shot rang out, echoing through the canyon. Then another. The sheriff dropped behind a boulder, firing back with precision born of years in the saddle. The air filled with smoke and thunder, the smell of gunpowder sharp and bitter. He fought not for glory, not for vengeance, but for the promise he'd made to a starving mother and her child. The fight raged until the canyon was choked with dust. When the last bullet fell silent, the sun stood high overhead. The sheriff's rifle was empty, his body heavy with pain, but the riders were gone, scattered or fallen. The silence that followed was deep, like the land itself was holding its breath. Hours later, the Carter family found the woman stumbling through the plains with her boy still alive in her arms. They took her in, fed her, and nursed the child back to health. For days she waited, staring toward the northern hills, hoping to see that familiar figure ride out of the desert. But no one came. Weeks passed before word reached Dry Creek. A ranch hand found the sheriff's body by the canyon's edge, his badge still pinned to his chest, his hat lying beside him. The men who had hunted him were gone, their names whispered only in shame. The town buried him on the hill overlooking the valley, where the wind never stopped blowing. The Apache widow came quietly one morning, her son beside her. The boy carried wildflowers in his small hands. She knelt at the grave, tracing his name carved into the wooden cross. "He saved us," she whispered. "He gave my son life." The boy looked up at her. "Was he a good man?" She smiled softly. "The best kind. One who did right when no one else would." They stayed a long while, the wind carrying the smell of rain and sage. When they finally left, she glanced back one last time at the lonely grave under the open sky. Somewhere deep in her heart she felt he wasn't gone, not really. The land had taken him, but his kindness lived on in her child's eyes. Years later, when the railroad came and the town grew into a bustling settlement, folks still spoke of the sheriff who'd died protecting an Apache woman and her son. Some called it foolish, others called it noble, but those who truly remembered him, the ones who'd seen his quiet courage, knew it was something more. It was redemption. And on certain evenings when the sun dipped low behind the ridge, travelers swore they saw a lone rider silhouetted against the sky, had tipped low, watching over the land he'd once sworn to protect. Whether it was truth or legend didn't matter much. In the heart of Dry Creek, his story had become part of the wind, a reminder that mercy, even in the roughest times, could outlive the hardest hate. The Apache widow grew old under that same sky, raising her boy into a man who worked the land and carried his mother's strength in his heart. She never forgot the sheriff, nor the night when kindness came from the hand of a man sworn to uphold a law that had never shown her mercy. In her final days, when she told the story to her grandchildren, she would end it the same way every time, with a quiet smile and a single line. Sometimes, she would say, the bravest men don't fight for their own kind, they fight for what's right. And in that small truth lay the soul of the story, the sheriff's legacy, the widow's survival, and the proof that even in the old American frontier, where dust and hate ran deep, compassion could still take root and bloom like a wildflower in the desert.